Hi, I'm Kathleen Sabo of New Mexico Ethics Watch, and this is Ethics Now, conversations about ethics in everyday life. Our guest today is journalist Jeff Proctor, an investigative reporter for New Mexico In Depth and a contributing editor for the Santa Fe Reporter. In 2013, he was a finalist for the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award for reporting on systemic civil rights abuses by the Albuquerque Police Department. Jeff, welcome, and thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
You know, and I know that's an abbreviated introduction, but with all that you've done on this issue and others, it would take probably the whole program to list everything. But one thing I just want to let people know is that, you know, so you were a finalist in 2013, and it was around that time that you and I sat down behind microphones at KUNM when I was hosting the Collins Show, and we were talking about police reform. And so here we are in 2020, 7 years later, in the midst of what could be a sea change for policing and communities. There's change happening and being recommended all around us. So, you know, I'm curious, have you been continuing to report on policing during that 7-year period?
Yes, very much so. And even before that time we spoke, in whether it was 2012 or 2013, I can remember sitting down with one or more of your predecessors in about 2005 to talk about police reform and attempts at remaking what then existed as the Police Oversight Commission here in Albuquerque. And yes, I've very much continued to report on policing since 2013. Mostly on the Albuquerque Police Department those first couple of years. And then after that, really kind of in about 2016 and early 2017, my focus shifted to federal law enforcement, in particular the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, better known as the ATF. So yeah, I have continued apace in terms of reporting on policing and police misconduct and police abuses and police reform.
Why do you think this is, you know, an ongoing issue of import over this long time period? And I mean, and beyond 2005, I'm sure as well, back beyond that, you know?
Well, I think police in general and the way police interact with communities, I think it is the most immediate and visceral and everyday experience that normal citizens and residents have with state power. It's kind of the, you know, you hear all of these things about the way the upper reaches of government work and the way they exercise state power, whether that's the presidency or a governor or even a city council. The police, though, are the way that most people interact with the exercise of state power. And it's also one of the ways that state power can go the most sideways. And when it goes sideways with policing, there tend to be incredibly high stakes and consequences. Police officers, of course, are armed, and they're often sent to see people or interact with folks in the community while they are having the worst day of their life. So it's sort of a fraught situation anyway. You've got an armed police department, and again, I mean, most folks never go to a city council meeting. Almost all folks have gotten a speeding ticket. So I think that's why this is an issue that has always been so at the fore of American life. And again, because of those various kind of circumstances or criteria that I just listed, I think that's part of why we have so perennially thought about ways to reimagine the way policing should look.
Well, and you know, one realization that sort of dawned on me again when this, you know, uprising started to happen and protests is, my gosh, we hire the police, we being whatever community we're in, and we hire them to protect us. We don't hire them to hurt us or, you know, to commit the types of abuses that we've been seeing run rampant recently.
I think that is the sort of highest societal ideal of what the police are for. that they are supposed to be guardians, not warriors. And again, I think that's unfortunately the way things have played out in this country over the last, 60, 70, 80 years. And in various iterations, I think that concept has unfortunately become aspirational.
Well, and when we arm them with weapons of war, surplus or otherwise, then the line gets even more muddied, I believe.
I think that's true. And you really did start to, that of course all began, the notion of the SWAT team, the so-called Special Weapons and Tactics teams. The very first one was in Los Angeles, and it was formed in response to the Watts riots.
Yeah.
So basically to sort of put down a black uprising around the conditions that folks were forced to live in different parts of Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, and this is a tangent, you can stop me if you'd like, one of the guys who was on the very first SWAT team in Los Angeles, again, formed in response to the Watts riots, was put on as a defense expert witness in the first murder trial for an on-duty police shooting in Albuquerque ever. So just to bring the whole thing kind of full circle, this guy had been one of the original SWAT team guys in LA, and now basically what he does is work as a defense expert witness when a police officer gets charged with a crime to kind of explain away the police action.
And you're right, that is full circle to what happened then and what we're seeing today, and maybe not many changes in between. So you and I are here today to talk about a small slice of what we can probably call ethical policing. And as with any government body, one of the essentials of ethical behavior for a government organization or body is transparency. And yet we see secrecy perpetuated throughout policing. So tell us about your work in that area and your concerns about that level of secrecy, please.
Sure. I mean, you're right that secrecy exists at a number of different levels in terms of the way police departments function, the way police departments and their officers interact with prosecutors, the way they interact with elected officials, sometimes the way they interact with people in the community who they are responding to calls for service from. The area that I have focused quite a bit on over the course of the last decade has been secrecy and a hope for transparency around the way internal police accountability systems work. In other words, every police department has what they call in cop speak SOPs. That stands for Standard Operating Procedures. And often an officer is involved in some kind of an interaction, whether it's a use of force against somebody, whether it's the number of different scenarios are sort of endless, and they're often become the targets of what are called internal affairs investigations to determine whether they've violated their own department policies, and as such, whether they should be disciplined for that. And so I think it's important for your listeners to know there's a difference here in what folks are pushing for often in the streets, which is criminal accountability for police officers. Right. That's something that I think a lot of people in the community want to see a lot more of. They believe that cops aren't charged with crimes often enough. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is an administrative remedy, an internal remedy that's supposed to be that department's accountability system to make sure that their officers are not just following the Constitution and the law, but following the department's own policies. And what I found when I began kind of scratching at this, probably 2008, 2009, back when I was at the Albuquerque Journal, was that often, whether it was in the city of Albuquerque, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department, or really a lot of law enforcement agencies around the state, was that when something would happen, whether there was a shooting or anything else, I would go back and follow up a couple of months later and say, hey, how did your internal investigation turn out? did you find that that officer violated your policy when he shot that guy in the back? And if so, is he still on the force? Was he suspended for 120 hours? And what I found was most agencies in the state did not produce that information. They kept that secret, including in the city of Albuquerque. And so I sort of started to move around 2010 past just asking the question and trying to use the Inspection of Public Records Act, which is our kind of document-based sunshine law here in New Mexico, which, by the way, is a fantastic law. It's one of the better sunshine laws in the country. Unfortunately, it's just not always followed, and we don't have great enforcement here for when it isn't. But in any case, I started to send these public records requests to these agencies saying, like, I'm not asking anymore. This is a formal request under the IPRA, and I want to see the documents that show how your investigation concluded and how the officer was disciplined. And what I met in doing this with a ton of agencies, again, most notably Albuquerque, was that they considered the police officer discipline records to be a matter of opinion. And to get just a little in the weeds here, matters of opinion contained in a personnel file are one of the things that the government is allowed to hold back under the Inspection of Public Records Act. It's supposed to be a really narrow exemption, but these law enforcement agencies were interpreting it really broadly. So that was the excuse they were giving me for not producing these records.
Well, and Jeff, just so listeners know, underneath the show description is a list of resources, and we'll put a link in there to the Inspection of Public Records Act, or IPRA, so people can take a look at that themselves. But it doesn't sort of make common sense that a disciplinary action would be a matter of opinion. I mean, does it?
Right. So the history on this, we've won a couple of victories over time. And when I say we, I mean the press, the Foundation for Open Government, and others who've kind of tried to help the press pry some of these secrets out of the government. One was in a very famous case known as Cox versus the Department of Public Safety. And in that case, we got all of the courts in New Mexico to agree that the simple location of a record doesn't make it secret. So what we found out was happening was often that these law enforcement agencies, most notably the state police in that case, were taking documents and sticking them in personnel files simply to cite that exemption under the Inspection of Public Records Act. And so we got courts to say, like, hey, just because you took this document and slipped it into this guy's personnel file does not mean the public doesn't get to see it. So that was kind of victory number one. And I have to give a shout out to my former colleagues, Colleen Heald in particular, and the lawyers who worked really hard on that case to win that victory. That was a big one. The next one sort of came, and this wasn't something that we ended up taking to court, but I was in this 2.5 or 3 year cage match with the city of Albuquerque, first under Mayor Chavez, then under Mayor Berry. They were so inconsistent at APD. In one case, I wanted to know the officer discipline, and they'd tell me happily. And of course, what I found out later and was able to report on was if it was an officer that they didn't like, they were happy to tell me that that officer caught a suspension or got fired or whatever. But if it was one of the sort of chosen few, they wouldn't. And so fast forward to, I want to say it was 2012, we had pressured them enough, and I think they were just sick of me sending these public records requests. And the Journal's lawyers at the time, who would have been Chuck Pfeiffer, Jim Dines, who later went on to be in the legislature. And I mean, those guys, they taught me a lot, and they fought a lot of great battles with me. And I think we finally, we made them so tired of us coming that the city attorney at the time, David Turek, wrote this memo basically saying, like, we just don't have any legal grounds to continue to claim matters of opinion. From now on, it is the policy of the city of Albuquerque to release police officer disciplinary records, which again was a a big win for us, and I think for the public to finally be able. And that was a crucial time. That's 2012 into early 13. This is during the massive spike in fatal police shootings we had here that ultimately led to the Justice Department investigation, which, fast forward to today, it's the reason any reform is happening at the Albuquerque Police Department. So it was really important to get that memo out of Torek and start. It really expanded the scope and the breadth of what I was able to tell the journal's readers, because I could report on these instances of excessive force or other types of misconduct, but I wasn't able to put the bow on it and say, this is the way the department viewed that. And I think what I was able to demonstrate once I was able to start getting these disciplinary records was that the internal accountability mechanisms at APD were fundamentally busted. And they just weren't holding officers accountable, no matter how egregious the conduct. And frankly, I think that was part of what made the Justice Department decide this place needs the full treatment.
So let's just step back a minute, because it may be completely obvious, but let's state the obvious here. Why is it important for the public to have this disciplinary related information?
Well, I mean, the most important reason is to be for residents, for citizens, to be able to measure that internal accountability mechanism, right? To be able to, and even this is back before the body cameras, right? But there was plenty of bystander video, surveillance video, that kind of thing. So residents are able to see this instance where, there's a suspect on the ground and the officers are kicking the guy. And I get that video. We post it on the Journal's website. I write a couple of stories about it. The citizens see that. They're pissed off, right? They see that use of force. It doesn't look right to them. It's really important for the people who pay police officers and their supervisors to know how those supervisors viewed that event, whether they believed that it rose to the level of professional conduct that the department is supposed to uphold. And without knowing how that discipline is meted out or not meted out, residents are left in the dark in terms of why this officer is or is not still on the force. It also cuts the other way. Sometimes policing is a rough business. Sometimes the use of force it looks really bad on camera when it's in fact not. Sometimes that's an example of an officer following training. They're in the process of trying to arrest an incredibly violent suspect. And yeah, that looks bad. He had to put his knee in his back, but if you really look closely, that suspect was really, really struggling, going for a knife that you couldn't see in the video. And they followed their training and did a good job of getting that guy in handcuffs instead of blowing his brains out all over the pavement underneath him, right? So in that instance, it's important to release those disciplinary records, the results of those internal affairs investigations, and for a police supervisor to stand in front of that and say, we know this doesn't look good, but let us walk you through why this was an example of good policing. So it really does it cuts the people who ultimately employ police officers and pay police officers, and who, as you said at the beginning of our conversation, are supposed to be protected by police officers. It cuts us out of understanding that internal accountability mechanism.
So just a tangent for a minute, and then we'll get back to this. But that's not the end of the story, is it? Because the officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I mean, it certainly came out that he had numerous complaints, including some shootings lodged against him. And I can't remember, did that come out because it's just part of what Minneapolis releases to the public, or did it come out in filings afterward? But there's got to be some follow-up once the public finds out that information, doesn't it?
Right. Well, so in that instance, it came out because of a few hardworking journalists who basically showed up at City Hall with pitchforks and torches and told us and told them, give us everything you've got on this cop. There are people in the streets, right? And so Minneapolis did not have a good history of releasing the facts of police officer discipline, right? So yes, that is never the end of the story. You get an officer who's involved, who uses force in a way that is unpalatable to the public. That we want to know, like, what that officer's history is. That one instance and how discipline turned out or didn't in that one instance definitely is not the beginning or end of the story. We came to find out later that, like at APD, for example, they had this thing called the early warning system in place for quite some time. And that we'd never known about it. I'd never known this existed. I want to say I discovered it in 2010 or 2011, just through sources telling me that it existed, and that lists were kept of officers who'd used force 3 times over the course of a 6 or 8 month period. They were supposed to have gone into this early warning system. And once you popped a flag in the early warning system, you were supposed to get additional training so that, you stopped pushing people's faces into curbs and those kinds of things. And what we discovered was the lists existed, but they'd never done anything with them. Wow. And that was another big flag for the Justice Department, showing them again that those internal accountability mechanisms just aren't working.
Oh, so now off the tangent back, and here's your softball question. I'm getting ready to pitch it. So once Albuquerque changed its policy, everybody in the state followed suit, right?
Alas, Kathleen. No, that is not what happened. In fact, there are still plenty of agencies. It's a mixed bag in the state at this point. It's not quite 50-50. I would say it's probably 55-45 or 60-40 in favor of departments that do disclose, but there are still some big ones that don't, notably the Santa Fe Police Department. And so to fast forward to now, I am back in that cage match again that I was in with Albuquerque such a long time ago with the Santa Fe Police Department. And in fact, we the endless nasty grams from our lawyers, in this case, Kate Murray and Daniel Hellam, great friends and terrific lawyers who've been at our side through a lot of really important fights. We just got to the point where even all of the cajoling and attempts at sit-downs with our legal team just weren't working. We were not convincing or swaying the city of Santa Fe. So we sued them over some disciplinary files for officers who we know have disciplinary files, and the city wouldn't cough them up. And really, fortunately, just in the last couple of weeks, we won a potential little victory in that case where Judge Beachide up in Santa Fe ruled that they had improperly withheld some of these disciplinary records. So it's early yet to say that we've won that case, but certainly we have a leg up at this point because we have an opinion from a district court judge saying that at least some of those records that we requested should be turned over.
And we'll also have a link for listeners to the story, the recent reporter story that talks about that decision. But you also sent me a link to a story from 2017 in which a bunch of people said, we could get clarity on this if the legislature decided to take action, or if the Attorney General decided to provide some clarity on this issue. Why hasn't that happened? Is it the power of the police unions? Is it why?
I will say that I don't think I will say that I do not think the police unions have the kind of clout or power or authority in New Mexico that they did 10 years ago, and definitely not 20 years ago. So I'm not saying that isn't part of it. Sure, the police unions and other factions aligned with the police unions do still form an important and formidable political coalition. I don't think that's 100% of the answer. Let's take those two issues separately. Okay. The legislature and the Attorney General. So important for folks to know, first and foremost, that one of the many jobs of the Attorney General in our state is to enforce the Inspection of Public Records Act. Right. So through all of these years, and before we sued the city of Santa Fe this time around, through all these years, there have been many times with multiple attorneys general, whether it's back to Patsy Madrid or Gary King, and now Hector Valderas, we've asked many times for an opinion, an advisory opinion on on whether this should be disclosable under the IPRA. No attorney general has ever waded into that territory. And I'll tell a story. You mentioned that 2017 piece that I wrote. When I wrote that story, I had Attorney General Valderas on the phone and was interviewing him for the piece, and asked him point blank, should the fact of police officer discipline be releasable under the Inspection of Public Records Act, or do you agree with the city of Santa Fe that the fact of police officer discipline is somebody's opinion? He actually handed the telephone to a subordinate at that moment, and the subordinate didn't answer the question either. So I never have gotten a great sort of fulsome explanation for why he wasn't willing to kind of stand in front of whatever he believes about that. But I know that during the end of Mayor Javier Martinez's, Javier Gonzalez's tenure in Santa Fe, he actually had contacted the Attorney General and asked for an opinion himself on whether that should be releasable, and we still don't have that opinion. So why the Attorney General has not exercised his authority and frankly his responsibility to weigh in on this issue, I cannot answer that question. I just know that he hasn't. Now, the legislature is a different question. The legislature could absolutely clarify its intent under IPRA in terms of that matters of opinion exception. They could absolutely pass a statewide law or go in and make a kind of tightening of that portion of IPRA to make it crystal clear that the law of the land is the fact of police officer discipline is public record. That is just something that hasn't happened. It seems, for whatever reason, to be politically unpopular. I do think that we live in a state that a lot of folks see as a really blue state. I don't think that's accurate. It's more of a purple state. There is a really kind of thick vein coursing through New Mexico of, sort of support no matter what for law enforcement. I think legislators are reticent to upset some of their constituents by doing something like this. Although I just think it'd be a simple matter of messaging, really. I don't know why this would upset people who, sort of support the police in most instances. If you're that person who believes that the police are a force for good in society, you would want transparency in these disciplinary records. You'd want to be able to say, this cop was investigated and cleared in that instance. So it's a really difficult one to figure out. Although I will say, given the moment right now, it feels like that is something we might see that get pushed forward. I don't know if you're going to see a bill this session, but I think now is a time to have so many of the conversations around policing that folks have not been willing to have in the past, and I really do hope that this becomes one of them.
Well, and just to catch people up if they're not aware, the legislature in New York just passed a bill doing away with disciplinary secrecy for police and chokeholds and other things. And I don't know whether Governor Cuomo has signed that yet, but I did see that Speaker Egolf here in New Mexico came out and said he wants some police reform, on the docket for the special session. Obviously, the governor has to make that call because it's a budget session, but he wants it on the session. And I know that he wants to deal with qualified immunity, but why not deal with the disciplinary secrecy at the same time as well? I mean, maybe a call for that would help him find a way to make that happen.
Maybe so. And I mean, certainly we'll be speaking with the speaker in the coming days to ask if that's one that he's open to doing. And the governor does seem open to some of this too. Some of it is qualified immunity is a bit of a stickier wicket. I think you will definitely see a statewide ban on chokeholds. I think that's a no-brainer at this point. I can't imagine that won't pass and get signed. And I think you will also see, I think you'll also see a statewide requirement for the body cameras, which again is a no-brainer at this point. It's 2020, folks. It's time that every officer in our state be required. I mean, it's part of the uniform now. I'm sorry, that's the way it is. And I mean, even departments that didn't want to do this, the Albuquerque Police Department was actually an early adopter of body cameras, and the officers in the union at the time hated it. They didn't want to do that, but they got dragged kicking and screaming. And at this point, there are very few officers at APD who don't just accept the fact that that's part of the uniform. I think you'll see that one too. If the speaker really does want to push qualified immunity, I'm very interested to see how that debate plays out. The officer discipline piece, I don't know if that will be something that ends up going on the agenda this time. Part of me really hopes that it does. And again, we're going to be in the early part of the week before the session, pushing a lot of folks to ask whether this is something that should be included, because it really is a very easy fix, and it's such a common sense fix. I want to state it like crystal clear in a way that so many of the lawyers who've helped us in the past, I want to say Greg Williams was the first guy who I ever heard put it this bluntly and succinctly. When a police officer gets disciplined, right, that is a fact. It is not someone's opinion. So that is just so, I don't frankly, Kathleen, know why we even need a legislative clarification on that. It seems, if you want to get into the concept of legislative intent, I'm not sure what else they could have intended there, right? I mean, Officer Jones violated policy number 62-3B and received a 40-hour suspension for it. I just don't understand the interpretation of that being someone's opinion.
Well, listen, I know you're a reporter and not an advocate, but it sounds like there are certainly ways that citizens can make their voices heard, and what they want to see coming up in this special session and beyond.
I think so too. And frankly, on this particular issue, I'm probably a bit of an advocate. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't report on these issues as well. I've done this long enough now where, and again, I've seen what I personally consider to be the positive impact of a city changing course on this. Again, I can't stress enough how important it was to what ultimately took place in Albuquerque to be able to report on these pieces of what was going on here. I really think it made all the difference in terms of an outside entity coming in and taking a look at what was going on here. They were able, the Justice Department, they were able, because of this, to see how completely dysfunctional the accountability mechanisms were here.
Well, have you seen a public appetite in Santa Fe for the change that may be, heralded by this decision or not? Or
yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, we've seen an appetite for it. We get letters about it every time we write about it. There are very, very few folks up there, at least in terms of our readership, who've said, we don't know why you guys keep pushing this. We don't need to know. I don't know anybody who doesn't need to know that, or even anybody who thinks they don't need to know that, right? And look, I think it's also important to say, there are things in a police officer's personnel file that I understand as a journalist or as a citizen, I don't get to see. Right. There are things that are, in fact, matters of opinion. For example, like a job performance evaluation. Right? That is somebody's opinion. How is this cop doing their job? A supervisor has an opinion about how the officer is doing his or her job. So that is something that I totally understand. The legislature did, in fact, intend to keep from the public for a very important reason. That's just somebody's opinion. That's not Officer X violated Y policy, received, Z discipline.
Well, Jeff, as we said at the outset, this is just a small slice of ethical policing issues, but it seems like a bedrock one, the transparency issue for the public. But is there anything more you want to say in closing, as and we'll probably be visiting some of these other issues involving ethical policing as we go along with the Ethics Now podcast, but anything you want to say in closing to our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last thing I would say, you're right. This is a bedrock, foundational issue for anyone who wants to see better outcomes between the police and the folks they are tasked with protecting. So, everyone I'm sure has heard of the 8 can't wait
Right.
reforms, and all of the other ideas that are out there floating around, maybe even some of the defund the police ideas that are floating around out there. All of those are effectively kneecapped if we don't have this one. You are not able to see how that internal discipline mechanism works, doesn't work, is supposed to work, and if you can't do that, I think it really does undercut every other idea that you've got, that anybody's got, to fix policing and make it function for more people.
Well, thanks for the work that you do, shining the light on these issues and many others. I do want to thank you, our guest, investigative reporter Jeff Proctor, for joining us. You can connect to every Ethics Now episode on www.ethicsnow.org or on all major podcast platforms. Visit our Ethics Watch Facebook page to suggest topics or guests, or email us at ethicsnowshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time on Ethics Now. Be well. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome.